Thank you. And I want to talk about the review of electricity market arrangements, otherwise affectionately known as REMA. But I just wanted to just ask Ms. Raw one question on hydrogen. And that was simply, and I'm thinking particularly with your fund management background with this question, what do you think the economic opportunity is for the UK if we get this right? How significant is it on hydrogen?
Well, it could be very significant for two reasons. One, the ability to export the expertise. So from a UK PLC perspective, to be able to apply the learnings from the UK and apply them globally, you could, effectively grow business exponentially, because the thing about green hydrogen in particular is it's very scalable. You're able to then scale hydrogen globally, and particularly where your resources, so your sun and your wind, are able to do that. So that's point one. Point two is then the ability to export hydrogen. Now, our competitive position relative to other countries, we'd need to weigh that up, but that very much is defined by policy, defined by pace, and also when you look at offshore wind, I think that there's that sort of trite phrase with the Saudi Arabia of wind. We could actually be able to grow that capacity fast and therefore be able to accelerate and be ahead of the game versus solar, green hydrogen, for example, in Africa or Middle East. So those would be the two ways that you could really benefit, the UK could benefit from the hydrogen economy.
Great, thank you. It's very good to hear the Saudi Arabia of wind phrase again. We've missed it in these halls. On REMA, and this is first of all to you, Ms. Raw, again, but I'd like comments from others on this particular point. What outcomes do you think are required from REMA to ensure that investment support schemes, such as the capacity market, bring forward the optimal technology mix at a cost that is viable or affordable?
So to sort of reinforce the point you've just made, market reform is required in order to be able to prepare us for a renewables-led system, which our current system isn't designed for. So that just reinforces what you said. In order to be able to create this low-carbon, renewables-led energy system, we need a market that reflects that. So there are three things that I would sort of focus on in terms of delivering that. The first would be around non-flex low-carbon generation, and what I mean by that is renewables, but it covers multiple forms of renewables. And really, how do you provide investment certainty over time? And so from our perspective, it would be rolling out and extending the CFD structure that exists today. And that can be voluntary. But in terms of a lot of the discussions that went into the levy, actually being able to disconnect renewables from the gas market and be able to deliver that investment certainty over time, that's where the CFD benefits. The second thing would be the capacity mechanism. And so really that's around how do you design it in such a way that it supports low carbon alternatives. So at the moment, the way the system is working for CCS, for example, and for hydrogen, is that we would sit outside of the capacity mechanism, through a dispatchable power agreement. But when you look at potentially peaker power, OCGTs powered by hydrogen rather than gas, then they would be selling into the capacity mechanism. And so what you need to ensure is that the mechanism is designed that they would be preferred to unabated gas. And so if you don't have hydrogen at a cost competitive level yet relative to gas, how would you do that? So that's a fundamental issue. The third largest one is around really how do you keep the cost of capital as low as possible to deliver the £350 billion, which is what SSE estimates, of capital that is required to deliver net zero. That's fundamentally when you step back and you say, what does REMA need to deliver? And it needs to deliver a structure that allows that investment to take place at as low a cost of capital as possible.
Right. Any of the other witnesses have any comments that are differing to that or in addition?
Just to say that going beyond...
Don't worry about the bells.
Going beyond the energy market reform, there's a lot of other blockages. There's a real blockage in planning. the time it takes to get a wind farm from entering the pipeline all the way to being deployed is just far too long. So there needs to be some kind of way that making that more efficient. And there's also again, outside the market, the issue of transmission and making sure that if all this power is going to be being produced in the north and the population centres are big population centres in the south, like making sure that there's that transmission can get the electricity to where it's needed. So those are two really key things that kind of sit outside the electricity market reform and haven't been addressed yet.
Just to go back to the market reform, think tanks in particular Onward, but I'm sure others have as well, argue that so in effect the government's created bespoke support schemes for CCS and hydrogen. Certain think tanks have argued that by limiting competition between these technologies, the government risks procuring a sort of weird mix of technologies and therefore making itself vulnerable to lots of lobbying for lots of different people trying to get their technology to be the number one. Therefore, perhaps the government should just have one single mechanism, which is a sort of one-size-fits-all to limit that. Do you think that makes sense?
I'd kind of argue the counter that with the example of things like offshore wind, you do have to, at some point you have to pick winners, and it might be expensive to begin with, but you do have to test them forward. It's very difficult to design a model that can support both these two very different technologies, which have very different, particularly in the way they're transported and stored. Very difficult to design one single thing that would equally boost them.
So it's clearly a very different energy system than we've had previously, and underpinning it has got to be the renewables. But that puts requirements on the system around flexibility and stability that maybe haven't been there in the past, and that needs to be a key output of whatever is the energy design process. And I think transport of energy, be that via electrons or hydrogen or gas, is an important part of that as we move energy around the country, because a lot of the energy is not where we need it as consumers, and that's going to be an important cost input into getting to the lowest, most reliable, flexible system.
Just to finish off, Ms. Powers, you've been admirably restrained. Anything you'd like to add or comment on?
I don't think so beyond really what's already been said, but I think to look at the future power system needs to be looked at as a whole, and back to the role of power CCS, and we need to consider the reductions, so the reductions in network reinforcements, the reducing the overall balancing costs as a result of scaling up the proportion of renewables on the system. That when we look at the whole package, we consider the role that each of these technologies is going to play.
Thank you. Thank you very much for that, Chair. Dr. Quiggin, the Climate Change Committee assumes that the BECCS facilities capture 90 to 95% of the carbon dioxide emitted. How effective today is BECCS currently at capturing and storing carbon emissions? And to what extent is there, contained within that answer, presumably, there's a trade-off between almost the amount of power generated and the percentage of carbon emissions, i.e. if you produce, you could game the stacks, so to speak, if you only produce a small amount of power, perhaps, or... So could you just give the committee a sense as to how effective BECCS is in those terms?
Sure. I think it's really important to say that obviously there are a lot of commercial interests in the development of CCS, and particularly CCS in relation to BECCS. So there's a lot of R&D trials that are being done that have not published into the public domain. So it's quite difficult, sat behind the wrong side of the paywall, as it were, to truly understand how effective it is. Theoretically, it's possible to capture 90-95% of the emissions. The issue becomes, as thermodynamics tells us, that separating a diffuse gas from a diffuse gas requires lots of energy. And essentially what CCS does in post-combustion capture, and the different types of CCS, is to use a solvent to bind the CO2 molecules to that solvent, and then you have to apply heat to the solvent to then release the CO2 such that you compress it, pipe it, transport it, put it underground. The question becomes, how much heat do you need to put in to that solvent to release that CO2 such that you can capture it? And where does that heat come from? You're diverting heat away from the biomass that you've burnt, which would otherwise turn water into steam to generate your electricity, and rather you're diverting some of that heat to your CCS process. Exactly how much gets diverted is still in the R&D phase, and we don't know what that energy penalty will be. And I can refer you back to the comments that I gave, or the evidence that I gave at the EAC back last year as to what I thought that energy penalty would be. At the time, I calculated it based on a report produced by Baringa, commissioned by Drax, to be around about 15 percentage points. So if you do the maths, basically Drax's power efficiency would fall from around about 36% down to around about 21%. To be fair on Drax, they submitted written evidence to the EAC that contradicted what I was saying, and so they were saying that it was going to fall from around about 40% down to around about 29%. So there's some dispute there. So they're saying an 11% or 11 percentage point fall in power production efficiency. I'm saying around about 15%. Let's sort of let's not worry about the kind of the splitting the hairs there. Lower power revenues will mean a higher cost to the consumer or the taxpayer or an industry participant who wants to buy that negative emission offset. So the question is, are they going to be really costly, these carbon emission offsets, the negative emissions? Because if you've got this big power production fall, then that CO2 being sequestered into the ground that Drax is going to have to charge someone for is going to become more expensive. So Ember did really great work trying to work out what sort of subsidy that Drax may require. I think if I have my memory correct, it's around 31.7 billion over 25 years for BECCS. My understanding of Ember's calculation is that does not include a big energy penalty, a big reduction in power efficiency. So the bigger that reduction in power efficiency, the higher that 31.7 billion is going to go. So yeah, I have grave concerns as to how much this technology is going to cost us when, let's be clear about it, there are other means of doing this, right? So one of the alternatives to BECCS, which I think is incredibly important for us to consider, is lower energy consumption. In the West in particular, we consume so much. We consume so much energy. And at the time when energy prices are rising and rising and rising, surely we need to consider more reducing our demand for energy whilst also decarbonising supply. And that could go a long way to actually meeting that emissions gap. And it wouldn't rely on expensive supply-side technologies that come with all the trade-offs and risks, such as increased food prices and so on and so on. I'll just read you one statement from the IPCC. They say, decent living standards are achievable at lower energy demand than previously thought, high confidence, and exhibit reduced trade-offs and negative consequences for SDGs relative to pathways with high consumption and emissions that are ultimately compensated by large quantities of BECCS.
Okay.
Right, yeah.
Mr. Gardiner, yeah. How effective is BECCS on your own?
I think the best way to respond to to Daniel's points is to sort of focus on sort of how we're going to get to net zero, right? And currently, the world has got a carbon budget remaining to maintain our sort of the planet within 1.5 degrees of about 400 billion tons, right? And that's basically 10 years, given where we're going, right? So actually, I think the world is increasingly recognizing that carbon removal technology is absolutely critical, right? And the two sort of scale possible carbon removal technologies that we've got are direct air capture, right? And I'm not dismissing the biochar space, but it's a smaller, as my colleague has pointed out, is direct air capture, which is extremely expensive, and BECCS, which is significantly less, right? And so you asked the question how confident we are, and I think this also plays importantly into how the business models will work, right? I mean, the expectation we have is that if we end up with a sort of a carbon plus power CFD from the government, which is the business model that's on the table, we will effectively make the investment ourselves in doing this, on the order of $1 billion per unit. And we will effectively get some compensation for that if and when we deliver at that 95% efficiency level, if and when we deliver the megawatt hours of power that we said that we need to deliver. So effectively, the point is that the risk is on the company as opposed to it's on the taxpayer, right? Or the consumer. They will not pay if it doesn't happen, right? If you take where the price of power is today, right? Again, I won't give you the precise numbers because we're in the middle of sort of commercial discussions, but we've submitted our proposal to be a BECCS Track 1 project. But we can deliver a megawatt hour of power, and I think Daniel likes to use the word, penalty, energy penalty. I mean, it does take power to deliver carbon removal, right? At the end of the day, I wouldn't call that a penalty. That's effectively, that's the input cost of delivering something that I think will have very significant
Can I just be clear?
value.
It's not what I call it. It's what academics call it. It's just called the energy penalty.
But the key point for me is that the efficiency effectively sort of implies that it's less efficient, obviously, when actually it's just the fact is that the power is being used for another purpose, right? It's being used to remove the CO2 permanently from the atmosphere and store it underground, right? So to finish my point, I mean, the cost of doing that, we estimate is significantly lower than the cost of just generating 1 megawatt hour of power today, right? So effectively you get the power, which is also renewable, and you get the carbon removal as well.
Okay. My last point, simply just to Dr. Cregan, because I thought, your point was very eloquently and powerfully made. What I would gently say is when you come to energy consumption, when you think of a global basis, we're actually mostly not worried. You're not going to be worried about the West. You're going to be worried about developing countries where their demand is going up at a rate of knots when they've got very high populations. And I'm not talking about China, in fact. China are much further along the curve on this. I'm talking about sub-Saharan Africa, I'm talking about India, other countries. And so that is almost a bigger issue than worrying about, exactly in the West where we're already at a very high level comparatively, would be what I would suggest.
Sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you. Yeah, I completely agree. I think it's an incredibly important point that you're making. Even more reason why we have to go further and faster now, which needs to include demand reduction and not rely on future technologies, which may or may not work as effectively as they. I mean, whenever we look into the future, it's always crystal ball gazing, right? I can make a prediction about the future. Drax can make a prediction about the future. Some academic can make a prediction about the future. It's always, to a degree, crystal ball gazing. What we have in our control right now is the ability to deploy solar, deploy wind, manage our demand. And if we're worried about rising consumption and therefore emissions in developing countries, which they should be allowed to industrialize, they should be allowed to have a higher standard of living, then we need to be even more cognizant and focus even more so on our consumption and our emissions now, which is why demand in the West needs to be on the table now. And, it's not a dichotomy. It's not like we do demand reduction now and don't do BECCS in the future. If we do more demand reduction now, more solar, more wind, and look at BECCS, let's see how it develops. But baking in over-reliance is risky and in my view, quite insane, actually. There's one study that shows that an over-reliance on BECCS BECCS and other GGRs, let's be fair, could lead to an additional temperature rise of 1.4 degrees just on its own through delayed and deterred efforts now.
Thank you, Chair.